Honourable Jill Evans, MEP from Wales, who will be giving their keynote speeches later on in the conference. Obviously, you know that we are served coffee and we have 2 more coffee breaks, and then there's a standing lunch. You have the Wi-Fi passwords if you need, and they are here, and obviously feel free to publicize this event on your social media channels. We are also being web streamed, hopefully even to an audience beyond the Maltese shores. And we will start our conference with 2 introductions by the main partners of this Translating Europe workshop. We have first Dr. Helga Zara from the Maltese Translation Department of the European Commission, and then we'll have a brief welcome speech also from our organizational partner, Inizjamed, and we have Mr. Kita Tsopardi. So, please, Helga.
Sorry, I have a reputation for destroying Commission property, so I'd better be careful. Dear participants, it is my pleasure as head of the Maltese Language Department within the Directorate General for Translation of the European Commission to welcome you to the 2018 edition of the Malta Translating Europe workshop, Digital Prospects, Online Support for the Maltese Language. Together with our partner, Inizjamed, we hope that this will be an enlightening and rewarding morning, which will lead to an exchange of ideas and further fruitful collaboration on the subject discussed today. The workshop's theme reflects the overarching motif of this year's Translating Europe Forum organized by DGT in Brussels and replicated through workshops like this in all member states: data, humans, and translation. Today, we will be reflecting on the way technology and data availability, even in language, can deliver on essential societal needs, with translation underpinning this scenario as a crucial tool for intercultural communication and intellectual transfer. Whilst DGT's external communication remit involves the promotion of multilingualism and translation, the Maltese Language Department also has an interest in outreach and advocacy for developments in the Maltese language, both in its daily work of translation and terminology research, and also with regards to all aspects of the status of the Maltese language as an EU official language. Through our field office in Valletta, we work towards this aim, even on a political level, as understood in the widest sense, where we monitor developments of the language and linguistic policy, perform outreach in all schools and educational institutions, collaborate with diplomatic missions in Malta on aspects related to language and culture, and also organize DGT flagship events such as the European Day of Languages, Juvenes Translatores, and today's yearly event. Even though the main mission of the Maltese Language Department is translating the Commission material in order to reach citizens and ensure legal certainty and clarity for the proposals and work of the EU's executive, we also view translation and language beyond the hallowed halls of Brussels and Luxembourg and strive to position ourselves in a way that our work acquires a concrete dimension within society. Today's theme is a timely one, as we will be discussing the way forward for a lesser spoken language like Maltese to be on par with other languages through technologies that are common and accessible to all of us in a connected world where geographical distances and discrepancies of size and power may not always matter, as they might have done before. Finally, I would like to welcome all our speakers who came on board to provide us with their experience and knowledge. I would like to welcome in particular our 2 keynote speakers from abroad, Dr. Theresa Lynn and the Honourable Jill Evans. And I will also be looking forward to the closing session, where we will be happy to welcome the Honourable Dr. Francis Amidemek and the Minister for Education and Employment, the Honourable Everest Bartolo. We trust that this conference will help pave the way for the future in the field of online tools, solutions, and accessibility for the Maltese language. I wish you a pleasant morning and a fruitful conference. Thank you.
Sinjuri, l-għodwa tajba. Fl-ispirtu ta' multilingwiżmu li nħadmu f'Inizjamed se nżgħu ma' drawwa li nintroduċu l-konferenza tal-lum kemm bil-Malti kif ukoll bl-Ingliż. It has become customary to introduce this conference in both Maltese and English. I will therefore start off by saying a few words in Maltese before introducing today's conference in English. Iċ-ċelebrazzjoni tal-lingwi permezz ta' traduzzjoni hija waħda mill-muturi ewlenin ta' Inizjamed u dan jiġduh l-avvenimenti li norganizzaw ewlieni fosthom il-Festival Mediterranju tal-Letteratura ta' Malta. Il-lingwa però mhix biss il-bidu u tmiem tal-esperjenza tagħna f'Inizjamed, għax wara kull lingwa hemm kultura u wara kull kelma hemm ġrajja. U għaldaqstant hija l-umanità tal-lingwa li taqgħadna bħala tim u tqarribna lejn l-udjenzi tagħna. Fil-każ ta' din is-serje ta' konferenzi, it-tema tal-esperjenza umana qabli li l-aktar li nħasset kien fl-edizzjoni tas-sena li għaddiet, intitolata biex niftehmu mit-traduzzjoni għall-integrazzjoni. Fija x'ħedna dawl fuq it-traduzzjoni bħala għodda ta' koeżjoni soċjali, fi kliem ieħor x'ħedna dawl fuq l-umanità tal-lingwa. Dan għamilnieh billi stedinna barranin Maltin u Maltin ta' barra, edukaturi li jaħdmu mal-immigranti u kelliema minn oqsma speċjalizzati li jmissu mal-bniedem fil-momenti l-aktar teneri, bħas-saħħa u l-kuntatt mal-korpi dixxiplinarji. Din is-sena għażilna li nittrattaw il-prospetti diġitali tal-sinna. Mad-daqqatajn din it-tema tista' tidher imbeda ħafna minn dik tas-sena l-oħra minħabba li nipperċepixxu qasma bejn dak li huwa naturali u dak li mhux. Fera meta t-teknoloġija qed issir f'ċertu sens aktar umana u li fija qed nestendu l-umanità tagħna permezz ta' għodod ġodda, it-tema ta' din is-sena mhix għajr żvilupp loġiku fuq it-tema tas-sena li għaddiet. Billi fis-sessjonijiet ta' dalgħodu se nistħarġu xi prospetti hemm sabiex nestendu b'mezzi diġitali din l-għodda essenzjalment umana, il-lingwa. On behalf of the cultural NGO Inizjamed, I welcome you to this 4th annual conference on translation in Malta, held in partnership with the Directorate General of Translation within the European Commission. Inizjamed celebrates languages not for the sake of languages themselves, but rather for the sake of the culture behind every language and the personal stories behind each word. Last year's conference exemplified this, being primarily about translation as a means of integration. This year's edition might therefore seem inconsistent with last year's theme. However, while not being a natural extension of last year's topic, this year's subject is definitely a logical extension to it since technology is fast becoming more human-like and it has become easier to express our humanity and reach out towards each other through digital means. While gimmicks such as granting citizenship to algorithms with hands of steel might put us off from taking the subject seriously, there are many other telltale signs that living digitally will intensify in the coming years. Blockchain technology is one of them. The European Commission's recent multi-billion proposal for further investment in the digital realm is yet another strong sign of such intensification. Today's conference might not be about supercomputers, cybersecurity, and trust, as is the Commission's proposal. It does, however, share some common ground when it comes to artificial intelligence, digital skills, and ensuring a wider use of digital technologies across the economy and society. And it is in this direction that this morning's conference will explore the prospects of extending, through digital means, a tool which is essentially human, that is, language. Thank you very much.
So parti, so we can kick off the conference and we are going to set the scene on what is happening digitally in the Maltese language. And our first speaker is my good friend, Dr. Tony Sant, who's a director of digital media and film at the University of Salford and also the director of the Spazio Creatività, which is the Creativity Centre at St. James Cavalier in Valletta, who will be presenting a paper on Maltese Wikipedija, which will be, I think, an ideal starting point for our discussion. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you very much, Mark, and good morning, everyone. Yes, it is a paper, but it's not a formal paper in the sense that I'm not going to stand here and read. As in, these are initial thoughts on the subject. I have been speaking about Wikipedia for the past 5 years in similar contexts, but this is the very first time I'm addressing the Maltese language Wikipedia. So just to put things into context, particularly why start with Wikipedia? A very popular internet culture, internet technology website has just published this article on 100 websites that shaped the internet as we know it. This is Gizmodo, and it was no surprise to me and to people like me, I suppose, that the #1 website they listed was Wikipedia. As you would expect, others like Google, YouTube, some of the retailer sites like eBay and Netflix are also in the top 10. But this does not reflect use, as it were, in the sense that if we were to look at this wonderful graphic, Mark told me to use colorful slides this morning, so I just put this one up. This is essentially an infographic of some sort of the most popular websites. And towards the center, of course, you'll see there in yellow, #1 is Google, #2 is YouTube. But down towards the bottom at #6 is Wikipedia, which also, when you consider what the other 5 are, makes it the top non-commercial website, even in terms of use. Yeah? So I think it is something to contend with, something not to be overlooked, and since it has now been around since 2001, well, I think it's proven it's got some staying power, shall we say. For those of you who are not too familiar with Wikipedia, although I'm sure that most people, if not all people in this room, have at least seen Wikipedia, if not read Wikipedia, well, we'll come to editing Wikipedia later. The mission of Wikipedia is quite lovely and simple, really. And it is to be read in one of those Hollywood trailer voices, which sounds something like, imagine a world in which every person on the planet shares in the sum of all human knowledge. That's what we're doing. That sort of thing, you know. But the bit that's left out is that it's all this is for free, and that free is a big and loaded word because it has multiple meanings. Free as in the famous free beer, but also free as in free as a bird. Yeah, so the gratis and libre. So it is truly free. And pertinently for today's gathering, it is in the language of your choice. Now, this is not an overstatement. We'll come back to that, the language of your choice. I think it's essential that I tell you also a little bit how Wikipedia works, how it is made possible. And this is done through volunteering. So it is purely a volunteer endeavor. There are 35 million registered users of Wikipedia. It's not to say people who visit Wikipedia, but people who at some point have given some personal details, even if it's just an email address or an imagined username of some sort. There's 35 million registered users. Of these, only 136,000 or so are what are known as active editors. That is to say, people who change the content of Wikipedia. And that's what the active editors are. And the number of administrators, that is to say, people who can delete pages, people who do some arbitration when, well, we're discussing controversial topics like whether it's reproduction rights or abortion, or whether it's Palestine or Israel, those sorts of things. You know, that's 1,200 of those. And I mention these numbers because I'll be coming back to these in relation to language in a minute. Also, it's useful to say what the pillars of Wikipedia are. To some degree, it's almost like a faith, you know, like the Judeo-Christian tradition has the 10 Commandments, and there are the Noble Truths in Buddhism, and so on and so forth in Islam, and what have you. The 5 pillars of Wikipedia are, the first, it's an encyclopedia. So let's not mistake it for anything else. It is, in the very sense of Diderot and the encyclopedists of old, it is an encyclopedia. It is also then, however, written from what we refer to as a neutral point of view. And what that means is that it embraces all point of views. So it doesn't take a line in relation to, again, to give the example I mentioned earlier, whether it's reproductive rights or abortion, whether it's pro-life or pro-choice. It is also free content that anyone can edit, use, modify, and share. And this is particularly pertinent within a session like this morning's organized by the European Commission in relation to the new copyright directive, for example. But I don't want to get too controversial, at least not just yet. The other pillar is that Wikipedia editors should respect each other. So there is never a sense that we will move away from any of these other pillars, but at the same time, this is founded by hippies or techno-hippies, so it doesn't have many firm rules. This is not to say it doesn't have any rules, but it doesn't have many firm rules. I won't go into much more about Wikipedia itself, and I'd like to come to the language. And that's what most of you find when you go to wikipedia.org. It gives you the option to pick a language, and you'll see that there's this massive list of languages. Wikipedia, there are versions of it in about 300 languages, including invented languages like Klingon, including dead languages like Latin, if you will. It's also in Pig Latin. But realistically, we are here this morning to speak about Maltese, of course. And Maltese in that universe is right there. So you can see it's not towards the top where we have languages that have over 1 million articles available in that languages, or even 100,000, not even 10,000, but just over 1,000 articles in Maltese in Wikipedia. And this is what I'll be focusing on, just to give you a sense of comparison. Yeah, so in the Maltese language Wikipedia, these are statistics I collected over the past few days, so these will be in flux, of course. So there are about 3,000 plus articles on the Maltese language Wikipedia. By contrast, on the English language Wikipedia, it's close to 6 million, really. Whereas in the Welsh Wikipedia, it's just over 100,000 articles. In Italian, it's about 1.5 million articles. In Icelandic, and I've picked Icelandic specifically for reasons that to anyone who knows both countries will know immediately why I picked this, is 46,000. And then I picked Swedish, also because of geographic proximity. The way I've included Italian to Maltese, I've included Swedish to Iceland. I guess it's useful for our comparison there. Swedish is one of the more popular languages for Wikipedia, and there are close to 4 million articles. And you'll see also the numbers of editors, vary accordingly. The number of administrators varies accordingly, and the number of active users, which, as I mentioned, are also editors. Now, let's simplify this a little bit and just focus on these, what do we call them, smaller languages, less used languages, less popular languages, if you will. And you'll see that there is a slight imbalance of some sort. Because even if we look at Maltese and Icelandic as an example, where there is a very rough calculation of the number of people around the world who speak and understand Maltese, that would be 500,000. Whereas Icelandic, it's even less than that. It's the famous old number that we used to use for the size of the Maltese population, 360,000 people speak Icelandic around the world. With Welsh, it's about 700,000, but that's about 19% of that is even outside Wales. So in Wales itself, it's about 500,000 really. Of course, our honorable friend here will correct me if I'm wrong on some of those figures. What I'd like to point out is another imbalance then, which is to say not just the number of articles, but also the number of administrators. And that is what drives, if you will, what drives the availability of the language. But then also the number of active users. And you'll see what a small number we have for the Maltese language for active users compared to either Welsh or Icelandic. And so this is what I will attempt to address for the rest of my presentation today. This is interestingly Jimmy Wales, one of the founders of Wikipedia, who about 5 or 6 years after Wikipedia was established, had this to say, particularly in reaction to the rise of the Welsh language Wikipedia, which incidentally is considered to be a success story in relation to a less used language, shall we say, in terms of Wikipedia. So certainly within Wikipedia right now, he's speaking about 10 years ago, 11, we are seeing some fairly successful projects in small European languages. You don't really need a Welsh language Wikipedia, perhaps. The number of people who speak Welsh who don't also speak Maltese is very small and getting smaller every day. Does this sound familiar in terms of Maltese? Okay, so why do we have a Welsh Wikipedia? Well, people wanted it, so we're making it. And language preservation is the main motive. It is their mother tongue and they want to keep it alive, keep its literature alive. Certainly some of the larger small languages like Basque and Catalan, again, two very successful examples of this sort of thing, have very successful projects. I definitely see that preserving parts of your language and culture through collaborative projects makes a lot of sense. So what is the reality on the ground? So here's the Welsh language Wikipedia and a timeline, if you will, for the Welsh language Wikipedia, and my next slide, I'll just show it to you and I'll come back to it, is a comparison for the Maltese one, right? So the Welsh language Wikipedia gets established within about 2 years from the creation of Wikipedia, and then over very little time, really, considerably, over a period of about 10 years, it reaches 50,000 articles. Just earlier this year, it exceeded the 100,000 article mark, which takes it into the category that's closer to the top used languages, if you will. It has been supported systematically, if you will, since 2012 through Wiki-Wales, which is essentially a user group, which in collaborating with Wikimedia UK, which is the chapter of the Wikimedia Foundation, which essentially is the legal entity that coordinates and owns the servers on which Wikimedia runs, through this, a proper user group was initiated and being an affiliate, if you will, of the Wikimedia Foundation just over a year ago. So you can see how, this has been supported. By comparison, forgive me for using I didn't know what to include for a dragon. I think, this is the equivalent of the Welsh dragon, so, it's just as problematic. So instead of here be dragons, here be, what is it, 8-pointed crosses? Sure, why not? So just a year later, the Maltese Language Wikipedia was started, and within a couple of years, it contained about 8,000 articles, many of which were translations of, the significant articles that you would expect, like, I don't know, the planets, for example. So, so you would want to have an article about each of the planets and so on and so forth. This only managed to double by 2010, and until 2014, it had only reached 3,000 articles. Until last month, at least, which was the last time I checked, it had not exceeded 4,000 articles. So this is a little pathetic, if you ask me, and I say this not as an insult, of course, and you'll see why this isn't meant as an insult in a minute or so. In November 2015, Wikimedia Community Malta was created, and I think this, again, had a similar sense and drive to do something similar to what I just explained in relation to Wales. The collaboration there, and this is how I am primarily involved in this, as the artistic director of Spazio Creativ, as Mark explained in the introduction. Through this collaboration, we've managed to create something called Wikimedia Community User Group Malta. In short, it's known as Wikimedia Community Malta. And this is now hopefully beginning to drive interest in Wikipedia. But this is and similar projects, and this is relatively recent. So just to close it up and give you a sense of the terrain, really. So there's the Wikimedia Foundation, which is based in San Francisco, which has, give or take, about 150 employees at any given time. It is donor funded, so there are no ads, and it is a non-profit organization. By comparison, the organization I used to work for, which is Wikimedia UK, is based in London. At any given point, it's had up to 17 employees. I was its education coordinator or education organizer, evangelizing, if you will, the use of Wikipedia in schools and universities. Yes, don't cite Wikipedia, write Wikipedia was our mantra. It is a local chapter that has about 300 members, give or take. It is a UK-based registered charity. And here is Wikimedia Malta, or Wikimedia Community Malta. It is based in Valletta. It has 0 employees. It is, right now, an affiliated user group. It is recognized by the Wikimedia Foundation. It is a registered voluntary organization. It has a VO number and everything with the Commission or the Council for the Voluntary Sector. And that's its website there. If you go to it, it's wikimalta.org. It is quite active, though, this Wikimedia Community Malta. And it organizes itself, or we organize ourselves, if I may use the first person here, around these 2 major events, which are Wiki Loves Monuments and Wiki Loves Art. And if any of you have heard of at least one of these, that's great. We're getting somewhere. If not, well, I'll continue speaking for another couple of minutes. Wiki Loves Monuments is a global photo contest that happens every September. Malta was included in this global contest since 2016. There are about 40 countries, including Antarctica, that take part in this. What is the language for Antarctica? Anyone? There you have it. So, and we work in collaboration with a number of public cultural organizations, and we reach out to historical societies and photography associations. It's a minor success, let's put it that way, in the sense that it yields some really spectacular photos that are then uploaded to the Wikimedia Commons and used in Wikipedia. You see here the winners for 2017 and 2016, which are now freely licensed images to be used of the Gozo Citadel and St. Thomas Tower. Wiki Loves Art is an opportunity to celebrate art, usually in February and March. It's been taking place in Malta since last year. Again, there's a number of collaborators, including artist-run art spaces. There are ideas for future collaborations with Musa and the Society of Art and Fondazione Patrimonio Malti, but it has already made a significant contribution in relation to this list of artists here. That is primarily, these are all dead artists, so it's not meant to promote anything. You see me there, or maybe you don't see me there in this one, but this is a workshop we had at the University of Malta a couple of years ago. This was the first Wiki Loves Art, to work on pages for the likes of Antoine Camilleri and Gabriel Caruana, which is also available in Catalan, by the way. So if you go to the Catalan language Wikipedia, you will find an article on Gabriel Caruana that was created during this event because we had a Catalan editor available at the session. And also art and feminism. So addressing the gender imbalance. I hope we're able to hear a little bit about that later today in relation to the use of technology and the gender imbalance. Anyhow, I'll leave it at that and close with this hope for the future, if you will. How can we improve the Wikipedija? That's how it's called in Maltese. That's not a typo. That's not an affectation. The adding of the J makes it the Maltese Encyclopedia tal-Wiki, which is the Wikipedija. So rather than saying Wikipedia bil-Malti, ideally we should be saying Wikipedija. Support is needed to expand the number of articles, of course. So we need to recruit and train new Maltese editors, including translators, which is when I was invited to speak here this morning, I jumped at the opportunity to come do this. This is how we also hopefully increase the number of Maltese admins, that can make Wikipedia function a little better so it can be taken a little more seriously. Wikimedia Community Malta, of course, needs to engage with Wikipedia more actively, and there are ways it can do this, including to create, translate, and edit more content. But most importantly, I think we need joined up efforts with others working to create Maltese language content online, and that includes a number of people in this room this morning, both in formal education settings from secondary school all the way to postgraduate levels, as well as in the cultural sector, spanning a number of institutions. And essentially, this is where I stop. I'll leave you with this number of logos here on the screen. This is the number of Wikimedia projects that are active. Wikipedia is just one of them. There's also Wikinews, Wikiquote, Wikibooks, and so on and so forth. So it is quite a substantial endeavor that backs up, if you will, Wikipedia. And I'm happy to speak more about that later or informally, even over coffee. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony. We'll pass on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Albert Gatt from the Institute of Linguistics and Language Technology at the University of Malta. And we'll have an overview of the tools and initiatives which are ongoing right now in academia with regards to digital for the Maltese language. Thank you, Dr. Gatt.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks everybody for coming out. I'd just like to begin with a small note because I think it matters to tell you a bit about what I do. I'm a computational linguist, which means I spend a lot of my time trying to build systems that one way or another use language. And if I'm working on English, or to some extent Dutch, or certainly German, I can worry about algorithms and systems, and I can immediately get to work, building whatever it is I'm trying to do. If I'm working on Maltese, I first have to spend a lot of time building the resources that I need before I can actually start working on the algorithms. And this is sort of the underlying motivation for most of what I'm going to say today, which is really an overview of things we've done and a number of complaints about things that we still need to do. The complaints are addressed to myself as well as to my colleagues and friends. Okay, so this is the outline of the talk. I'm not going to begin at the beginning because that would take too long. I'm going to begin from a report which I think is a fundamental milestone if you want to understand the state of language resources for Maltese, which came out in 2011. And then I'll take stock and give you an overview of what we have now, and then I'll talk about what we need to do going forward. But before I do that, by way of a premise, let me emphasize that the building block for any intelligent tool that uses natural language is data. Okay? The technology itself is today, contemporary NLP, contemporary natural language processing, relies extensively on machine learning. So when I talked about algorithms a minute ago, I'm talking about algorithms that learn, and they have to learn from data. So if we're going to do anything, we need the data, whether that's in the form of words, text, speech, hopefully transcribed, and if not, failing that, at least recorded to a sufficiently high quality, images accompanied with text, anything, right? And please repeat that as many times as you can. Yeah? If you want language technologies, you need data. So how do we collect the data? We do it in a number of different ways. When we build a system, one way in which we collect data is opportunistically. We just scrape the web. We use Wikipedia, we use whatever's available to build large repositories of data. By large, I mean preferably in the hundreds of millions of words. If it's billions, even better, right? But sometimes we also need to do it systematically. For example, I'm currently engaged in a project where we're more or less digitizing the entire body of laws of Malta in both languages, Maltese and English. And for that, you don't just sort of scrape opportunistically. You've got the laws, that's what you work with. And other times, we crowdsource. If we need to annotate our data, for example, to add labels to the data, we need judgments about something, or we actually need to elicit types of language utterances from people, then we often crowdsource. To give you an example of the kind of crowdsourcing we do, here's a... Oh, by the way, we can't crowdsource using large-scale platforms if we're working for Maltese. If you work on English or any of the relatively large languages, so languages with lots of speakers, you can use large platforms like Crowdflower and Mechanical Turk, and you can crowdsource stuff usually within weeks, and you get substantial amounts of data. That's because there are people working on these platforms who are paid for the work they do, but who actually know the languages in question, such as English. For Maltese, you can't do that, because you're not going to find many Maltese speakers on Amazon Mechanical Turk, for example, which is one of the most widely used crowdsourcing platforms. So when we crowdsource by creating our own code, and we actually sort of advertise, and we get quite good responses from Maltese-speaking individuals. As an example, one of my main research interests is in the link between computer vision and natural language, and one of the things we recently did, this is just by way of an example, was we wanted to source information from Maltese speakers about spatial relations and how they are expressed in language. So we showed people images like this, and we had to sort of draw bounding boxes around the objects in the images with labels, and then we're asking people to give us, what preposition would you use here? Would you say the horse is near the woman? Would you say the horse is in front of the woman, et cetera, et cetera? And what we're trying to do there is to build an AI model that can actually predict the right spatial expression to use in Maltese based on features of the image, geometric features of the image, because we actually sort of treat the image essentially as a bunch of numbers. That's one example. So that's the preamble, okay? Data is everything. So let's begin from this famous report. The report I'm talking about was a white paper that was published in 2011 as part of a series of white papers on which covered 30 languages of Europe. And that came out of the MetaNet project, the MetaNet consortium, which was led locally by Mike Rosner, who's sitting here. So if you want to sort of complain, he's your man. And actually, at the end of this project, different reports were published for each of the 30 languages, giving an account of the state of the art of the digital existence of these languages, right? And the various languages were classified on a number of axes, ranging from excellent support to weak or no support. And at the time, Maltese, and it wasn't the only one, in fact, most of the languages they looked at in these reports had weak to no support under most headings, okay? You won't be surprised to hear that the language which tended to have either excellent or good support in most fields was English, okay? That was 2011, and the press was quick to pick this up, and we got some doom and gloom. For example, this headline from the Times, Maltese is at risk of digital extinction. And that was nice, that was fun, because for a while people were actually discussing digital resources for Maltese in the papers, and I thought, yay, this is great, right? Something's going to happen. In fact, it did. So, I don't want to be negative. It did. Because if we take stock now and look, at what's been happening, I think the situation has dramatically improved, although it's far from perfect. So let me give you an overview of the kinds of resources and tools that we have for Maltese before I start complaining about what we don't have. A caveat first, this is a partial survey. I don't have time to give you a full survey. And also, if I had to give you a full account of the digital resource landscape in Maltese, I'd actually be talking about things which I might not necessarily know about, in the sense that a lot of companies, individuals, etc., including students, for example, when they're doing their projects, they create resources for their specific needs, and these do not necessarily feature as, loom large on the digital linguistic landscape for Maltese. So, there's a lot happening which we might not know about, and that's a point that I'll come to at the end, because it's an important one, okay? It also depends on how you count, what you count as a resource, right? So anyway, my starting point will be this survey, which grew out of a series of projects at the University of Malta, whose history we don't need to go into. It's called the Maltese Language Resource Survey. That's the URL, and if you go there, you'll see that there's various resources. The page is also in English, by the way, but it just seemed appropriate to have it in Maltese on my slide. There's corpora, there's lexical resources and tools and other stuff. It's all free, it's all downloadable, it's all usable, and we have several thousand users on 4 continents. The number of people interested in Maltese, also from a research perspective, is quite surprising. There are literally hundreds of linguists who are using our resources because they study Maltese academically, as one does. By way of an overview of the different kinds of resources, let me start with lexicons, lexical resources. The largest one we have is one called Jabra, which is an open lexicon for Maltese. By open, I mean both open as in freely available, as in free beer, but also open as in we collected the data using a variety of sources, and we were opportunistic about this. Most of this work was initiated by my colleague John Camilleri, and this actually grew out of a student project. It is a dictionary that was created initially, right, to address our needs as computer scientists and computational linguists. We needed electronic lexicons for our systems. And then we realized that actually there might be something there that might be useful for people. This is the kind of entry you get. For example, for the verb kitep, you get grammatical information that's shown on the left, English glosses, and you can also search in English in the dictionary. And then it's also a full form dictionary, so you get all the inflectional forms with grammatical information. So for a verb, you might get over 1,000 such forms. And when we realized that this might have utility beyond our sort of narrow scientific interests, we teamed up with the Malta Communications Authority and the Vodafone Foundation initially provided funding and created this version of the dictionary, which is the one that's most widely used publicly. That's just one example of a lexical resource. We have a few others created by me or my colleagues. You know, this is not all stuff that I did. One kind of interesting one is a dictionary of a historical dictionary of Maltese, which is actually a lexicon culled from historical sources, mostly from the 18th century. If you're interested in how Maltese was spelled 2 centuries ago, take a look at this dictionary. It's kind of interesting. And another one that's about to be launched in a few weeks is a dictionary of Maltese Sign Language. I shouldn't have included this because Maltese Sign Language is a different language. It's not Maltese with hands. But I wanted to bring it up because it's about to be launched literally within a few weeks. And creating this kind of lexicon is a very different exercise because a sign language dictionary is not words, it's video, pictures, and sign writing, which is the orthographic system used for signs. And that's work by my colleague Mari Alexander and her team. And finally, I want to mention an ongoing collaboration we have with terminologists in the DGT, Luxembourg primarily, but also Brussels, where we've, as part of their regular visits, et cetera, we've teamed up, and we have benefited enormously from this because we've incorporated the terminology from the terminology database that they've created for Maltese, the IATE, partially incorporated that into our lexical resources. And hopefully the benefits also go in the other direction because we have tried to help, for example, by creating automatic terminology translation tools, which are still kind of very basic, but hopefully they'll get better. That's lexicons. Corpora, huge bodies of text which we need to train our systems. There are learner corpora. I won't talk much about those, but they're available online. We also have domain-specific corpora, for example, EU law, bilingual EU legal corpora. These are searchable bodies of text which are online. And finally, we have general corpora, which was our mainstay for a long time, the creation of this large corpus of Maltese, which we needed both for linguistic research and for creating NLP tools in a data-driven fashion using machine learning techniques. So let me tell you a bit more about that. This Maltese corpus, which we call the Corpus Malti, has sort of evolved through 3 versions. The current version is version 3. And as you can see, it's grown by an order of, by a few orders of magnitude from an initial corpus of texts sampled from different sources to a 250 million corpus, labeled, annotated with grammatical information. Every single word and symbol has a label that says whether it's a noun or a preposition or whatever. Lemmatized, so each word has its morphological base form, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of linguistic information in these corpora. They are corpora of running text, taken from multiple sources, as you see here. And finally, I want to mention this because it was released 2 weeks ago. There's a universal dependency tree bank, a parsed tree bank, a parsed corpus of Maltese. So I can finally train a Maltese parser to analyze syntactic structure in Maltese. That's work by Slavomir Čeplo who did this as part of his PhD project. Okay, tools, part-of-speech taggers, morphological analysis and generation, some experimental work on parsing, which is now set to be given a boost given the new dependency tree bank that's just been released. Point is, since 2011, things have moved on substantially. But there's much more. There's a lot of work by individuals, companies, groups who do this as a labor of love, student projects, all kinds of things happening. So where do we need to go? This is the bit where I start complaining a bit, complaining in a constructive sense, I hope. I'm going to point out a few things that I think are still lacking, and then I'll just say what I think is the fundamental issue underlying all of these lacunae for Maltese in the digital age. First of all, there's a major lacuna in the development of responsive authoring aids, by which I mean things that help you write. That includes spell checkers, but not just. Okay, so anybody who's used SwiftKey, for example, knows that you can now quite viably write, decent Maltese with predictive prompts, etc., on your mobile phone, especially if you have an Android. It doesn't work so great on an iOS. But I'm sick of people telling me, why don't I have a spell checker for Maltese? You're a computational linguist. Why don't you create one? The truth is, I have, more than once. Because every time we do anything with text, we have to concoct some solution to treat noise in the text. And, that's basically the technology for spell checking. What you need to package this and make it available to people, that's actually a different problem, right? For which you need funding. Right? That was the word that's kind of at the back of my mind all the time. Second gap that I perceive, I am aware that there's a lot of usage of machine translation within specific settings. I know, for example, that in the European institutions, the reliance on machine-aided translation is now a day-to-day thing. People do use things like Google as well. But uptake for machine translation has been limited at best where Maltese is concerned. And that's a shame, because creating machine translation systems as of the last 5 years has become much easier, right? Because the technology is now easier to train. The data is the major bottleneck. We have a major lacuna in speech when it comes to speech technologies. We've seen some text-to-speech technologies developed. We're about to begin a project developing automatic speech recognition for Maltese. But the data that you need to create these systems involves an enormous amount of work. And there are many, many, many untapped resources which people have created, which we might not even be aware of. And we know, for example, that many offices, bodies, etc., create documents, whether they are laws, government documents, correspondence, the archives, etc. And we would dearly love to have access to this data because it's all there and we can use it. And we can use it for good, for good purposes. So, and another big question, which I think we'll hear more about from Teresa, is social media. I don't have a clear idea of how much Maltese is used on social media. I don't know if I can reliably use social media, for example, to study things like code switching. From what I've seen, I think I can. But, I haven't systematically researched this, and this is something that we really need to look into. So finally, what is really lacking, right, is, first of all, I think, a proper strategy for the curation and maintenance of digital resources. And there was a report that was published in 2016 by the ICT committee set up by the National Council for the Maltese Language, which argued for the creation of a central group of people that would curate such resources and make this a national project. And secondly, funding. We get funding for individual projects, right? But you need funding to sustain these resources and keep them usable and up to date for people to use over time. That's it for me, thank you. I don't do all this alone, of course. There's a whole lot of people you can blame. And that's it, thank you.
Very much, Dr. Gatt, and we'll move from one set of complaints to another. We have Mr. Mike Rosner. Mr. Mike Rosner from the University of Malta, Department of Intelligent Computer Systems, who is also the national anchor point for ELRC, which is European Language Resource Coordination, which is connected to the need to collect these data sources that Dr. Gatt just mentioned. Obviously, Mike will be able to give us a very focused view on what this project is all about, which is something which we are working together closely on this without much results as yet, but I will leave it to Mike to detail the problems and the eventual solutions of this project.
Okay, so I will start just by saying a little bit about my background. I also am at the University of Malta, and I work at the Department of AI, which is not specifically about linguistics, and I'm not a linguist, but my perspective has come from the AI point of view and from the position of natural language processing. And I'm also the national anchor point for this European language resource coordination, which I'll be talking about in the talk. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the following things, and I'm focusing mainly on machine translation, okay, as an application of natural language processing, and specifically towards Maltese. So what I'll talk about is why we need it, and a lot of this will be probably familiar to you. Why translation is difficult for both machines and people, how machine translation works, and why a machine translation with Maltese is particularly difficult. And then I'll conclude with some remarks about European language resource coordination, and I'll have a few complaints there as well. So we need translation. Why do we need it? Well, the volume of text available is increasing exponentially due to the increased technological availability of text on the web, on phones, everywhere. And what's more, it's increasing in languages we don't understand. So I don't mean necessarily just European languages, but the amount of text that's being made available in all languages is becoming is increasing at a great rate, and we can't necessarily understand it. Here we see in this little table that when you add another language, you increase the number of pairs of languages at a great rate. So if you've got two languages, there are two possible pairs of languages from one to the other and from the other back to the first one. When you get to 23 languages, which is the number of languages operating in the EU, there are 506 pairs. So many different translation pairs are necessary to get a full translation across all the different pairs. Now, the EU is committed to lowering language barriers across EU states, which means that there is some necessity to translate things. And in fact, this is enshrined in legislation both at EU level and also at national level in certain respects. So in 2014, the number of pages of text was 2 million, which was translated at EU level in sort of legalistic documents. And a large proportion, well, 1% of the EU budget is spent on translation services. So as the demand for translation increases, we're going to need some machine assistance, and that's why, in some sense, machine translation must be part of the solution. So what do we mean by machine translation? Well, machine translation has been thought about as probably the primeval natural language processing application. And Bar Hillel in 1960 talked about fully automatic, high-quality machine translation, in which the goals were the following: no human intervention, arbitrary kinds of text, high-quality output, low cost, and high speed, all those things. And the problem is this, is you can't get them all at once. It's very difficult. You can compromise on certain things, but to get them all at once, you have to make trade-offs. We'll be seeing some examples of that in a moment. Why translation is hard? Well, I think we know we've got some standard examples of silly things like this. notices where human translators have got it wrong. So in a hotel in Acapulco, the manager has personally passed all the water served here. There are some other examples as well, which I'll go into. These are all standard examples of where translation is wrong because of the nuances of either terminology or of grammar. So we accept that we can't have perfect translation with machines. One of the compromises is to lower the quality of the output, provided that you preserve some aspect of the meaning. And we have to recognize that there are situations where the ability to create less than perfect translations is still valuable. In this way, machine translation systems can take over some of the boring and repetitive tasks and leave to human translators the more creative aspects of the job. And the two kind of the two things to distinguish here, two different kinds of use, are translation for consumers. That's to say, gist translation, where as long as it's understandable, it doesn't really matter if it's not a perfect translation. Compared to the usage as a producer of text, if you want to write in the language which you don't understand, you need to get very high quality. But you may have to compromise in terms of the range of texts you're prepared to translate. So how does machine translation work? Well, essentially it works like this. You have an input and an output, and in the middle you have something which we'll just call a translation model. And what we can see on this slide is that what goes into that translation model is data of different kinds. So it might be in the form of corpora, it might be in the form of translation memories, it might be in the form of glossaries or lexical information, and it might be just human input. And the point is that there are many different ways of building translation models. The two which are sort of important are, well, what used to be thought of as the way to do this, which is a rule-based model where the knowledge of the translation is actually put in explicitly by translators in the form of rules. And these rules are of different kinds. Some of them have got to do with grammar. Some of them have got to do with word structure. Some of them will have to do with the internal structure of words and how these words would be translated. So you see these examples here where we can see a single word in Maltese being translated as many words, and in fact, a whole sentence in English. Now, we'll see later that the problem with this is that you have to have experts who know about linguistics to write these rules. More recently, as Albert was saying, the focus has been on data-driven models in which you don't write rules. What you do is you produce existing translations. You start with existing translations, a large corpora of existing translations, and then you start aligning them. So first you align the paragraphs, then you align the sentences, and then you observe what goes most often with what, or rather the machine does this. And it derives what we call translation probabilities. What is the most likely translation of this particular piece of the text? And then you try and put it all together, and then you apply this model, which you've derived from existing translations, to new sentences. And, I mean, you get the idea of what happens when you build the model from this slide here. So if you've got la maison, the house, la maison bleue, the blue house, la fleur, the flower, you've got those, let's say those fragments, those pairs of translations which already exist. And when you start, you have no knowledge about what translates as what. So the probability of the word, for example, the word la, taking the first pair of sentences, it could be either the or it could be house. And similarly for the la maison bleue and the blue house, the la could be the or it could be blue or it could be house. So you derive initially, and then you start off with the assumption that anything can translate as anything. But if you look at enough sentences, it starts to become clear that the probability that la is the, and that blue is bleu, and house is maison, becomes greater. The probability goes up if you see enough sentences with the right examples. And essentially, this is what you do this with large amounts of text, and you eventually build a translation model where the probabilities of the words and the phrases are not equal. And you build, then you look for the most likely translation of the sentence you've got. Now, why is it so difficult for us? Yes? No. Okay. Maltese is particularly difficult because if you use the rule-based approach, where you have a problem of it being very labor-intensive to build the rules, to get the knowledge into rules in a form where they can be used. We have very complex word formation rules in Maltese. We do not have a set of grammar rules of the kind we saw in the rule-based approach, which is machine-ready. And the language is also a mixed language, which has Semitic and Romance elements. So it has two different systems of rules operating. So these make it difficult. From the other side, from the data-driven side, the problems are really that there's a lack of parallel text data from which to derive these probabilistic models. And that's because the number of native speakers is relatively small compared to the larger languages. The fact that English dominates and has an odd effect on the requirement for translation in Malta. And the fact that translation is often not seen as very critical within government. I mean, the interest in getting things translated seems to be not very strong in government circles. The other problem is that there are some parallel texts that do exist, but they're very domain specific. So, as Albert mentioned, we have the laws of Malta, which are available in 2 languages, and from that you can derive a translation model. The government gazette, that also is bilingual, and so you can derive some information from that as well. But there are all kinds of other areas where we don't have parallel texts, and nevertheless we know that these texts exist. We know they exist, we don't know where they are. There's no centralized government service which can give us access to those texts or to even know where they are. They're probably produced in individual offices by somebody who happens to work there. They're then left on a computer, and nobody knows where they are. We don't know how to find them. And this will be in many areas like health and education and finance and social services and so on. So a large number of areas where translation models could be derived. Simply, we don't know where to find the data, and that's for us is a big problem. So that's where the European language resource comes in, the coordination comes in. And just to point out that the ELRC is a project of the so-called Connecting Europe facility. I'll say a few things about that. So the Connecting Europe facility basically supports the development of interconnected networks in Europe at different levels. For transport, they look at road connectivity, energy sharing and energy connectivity. And the one that interests us is in the telecoms area. And in the telecoms area, we talk about digital service infrastructures. Now, those are things like online dispute resolution, electronic exchange of social security information, procurement, business registration, security, open data, access to cultural information, and so on. And all of this is potentially cross-border. So if somebody in Greece wants to make a complaint about a Maltese company, the idea will be that this could happen transparently of language. And one of the underlying ideas here is that there would be a model, a translation model, which could be used, which would support kind of cross-border services multilingually. The ELRC is trying to coordinate the collection of language resources to improve translation in these different areas relevant to digital service infrastructures. Now, if you're going to have reasonable translation quality, the idea is that you have to have data which is relevant to the domain. Now, the EU has a translation platform which is essentially neutral to the domain it works in, but it needs to have data in the right domain. So if we were going to have a model which is going to deal with online dispute resolution, it's got to know about the language of online dispute resolution in Maltese as well as in the other languages. And similarly, for the other areas of these digital service infrastructures, if we're talking about business registration, there's another set of terminologies and uses of phrase which would be specific to the Maltese situation. Or in e-health or in education, there are different areas, and we're trying to access terminology and parallel data in those areas. With those, you can get good translation. And if we don't have that, we get translation which is of lower quality. So in-domain data is what we need. And what ELRC does then is it collects language resources, it identifies where those resources are, it engages with the providers of the resources and offers help, and tries to share the resources which are available on a server. So it's grown over the last few years. There are now more than 400 identified data holders in Europe. And there are, in each country, or most countries, there should be 2 anchor points. I'm one of the anchor points here. You can see from this graph that the collection of language resources has increased quite a lot. This is between April 1917 and 1918. For certain languages, there have been some increases. However, you'll see that Maltese is very low down on the list and hasn't changed. And the reason for that is that every country should have 2 anchor points. One technical one, that's me, and one government one who is going to help us identify these resources. Now, we don't have a national government anchor point. I've been trying to find one for the last 2 years, and I've found a sort of consistent lack of interest from government side, and this is my complaint. We need to have somebody identified in government who will look after the problem of helping us find language resources for translation. So the conclusion is that the language resource situation in Maltese has improved greatly over the last 5 years, but we lack resources for machine translation relevant to these DSI-related domains. Resources exist, but we need to identify the sources and secure collaboration with the data owners. ELRC can help, but cannot operate effectively without government help. We need a national anchor point from government. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me, there's my email address. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. We have a 10-minute coffee break offered by our caterers, Core Green, where we have some nice fair trade organic coffee and sweets. 10 minutes, and we'll get back to the industry section in 10 minutes. Thank you very much.